In this video, we're focusing on the gradient of a curve. So the gradient of a straight line measures the rate of change. So how does y change over t? So the formula we use is m equals rise over run, or if you have two coordinates, y2 minus y1 over x2 minus x1. And what I mean by that is if you go to draw these out, if you have two coordinates, here's my two coordinates, x1, oops, not that, x1, y1, and then x2, y2. You could substitute those coordinates into the formula to find the gradient. Now, if you have the gradient of a straight line, there's two things it can be. It can be positive, where the line is increasing, where it's going up from bottom left to top right, or negative, which is the line is decreasing from top left to bottom right. So positive and negative gradients. Now, straight lines increase at a constant rate, so the gradient's always the same everywhere along the line. When you start to talk about curves, the gradients change depending on what part of the curve you're looking at. Now, the tangent to a curve is a straight line that we draw that just touches the curve at one point. So here we have a parabola, and we have three tangents drawn. We have one in green, blue, and red. You can notice that the green tangent has a gradient, a negative gradient, all right, at that point. Then the red tangent has a positive gradient at that point. Notice that the turning point, that point at the very bottom, is flat. So we can use that to find turning points of a function. So if you ever have a gradient of a function that's 0, you know that that's where it's starting to turn. It's going either from a negative gradient to a positive, which is a minimum turning point, or it's going from a positive to a negative, which is a maximum turning point. But you'll learn that a bit later too. So, sketching gradients or derivative functions. Now, these are relatively easy if you're given the original function. So, some things to remember. If your derivative or the gradient is greater than 0, when you go to draw your gradient function, that part of it's going to be above the x-axis. Then if the gradient is less than 0, it's below, and if it's 0, it's on the x-axis. So what I mean by that is, here we have our original function. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go through and mark my gradients that is 0 first, and I know that occurs at turning points. So I know there's going to be a 0 here, a 0 here, and a 0 here. The next thing I want to do is label where my positive gradients are and my negatives are. So I'm going to start with my positives. So all along this part here, these are all positive gradients all the way up till I hit the 0. Same with over here, these are all positive gradients up until I hit the 0. And then I can do my negatives. So here's negatives going all the way down until I hit the 0. And then over here, 0 all the way down. So we can use what we've just done to draw our derivative function or our gradient function. All right, so here we have, you can see in the background, I've slightly placed the original. So what that means is the first thing what I need to do is put my zeros on the x-axis. So if I go down here, I know there's a 0 here. I know there's a 0 here and a 0 here. All right. Now, if I look to the left, if I'm looking over here in this part of the graph, you can notice that in the background, they're all positives. So what that means is that section is going to be above the x-axis. So it's going to come down to somewhere like this. If we're looking between our zeros, so between these two dots in the background, you can see that they're all negative. So I know that part's a negative below the x-axis. And then again, I have another positive part, and then I have another negative part. So that there is my gradient function for this. So when you're going to sketch these out, remember you label your zeros first on the original. Note where your positives are, so do pluses where the gradient is positive, do negatives where the gradient is negative, and then redraw it where if it's a positive gradient, it's above the x-axis, if it's negative, it's below, and if you have a 0, it crosses the x-axis.